afraid to use the chat box. But what I'm going to talk about is a toolbox for protecting in-stream flows. And so you may have a great river that you work on every day or that you love, but I'm not sure everybody always thinks about whether or not you've got water. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through this toolbox and explain to everybody some potential tools that you might want to use to protect some flows in your river system. The session objectives that I have for today is explain to everybody why do rivers need water. That sounds like that's kind of obvious, but I may talk about some other ideas that might be a little bit different approach than what you typically think about. And then I'll talk about this flow protection toolbox, and primarily about Federal Reserve water rights, which is a federal tool, then a state-based water rights or programs that many states have, and then other protection mechanisms that we typically use to protect in-stream flows, such as programmatic biological opinions or Wild and Scenic Rivers or Endangered Species Act, and our ability to participate in those processes. So one of the first things I would encourage you to do when you're looking at your river is consider the threats, and that may be obvious and many of you are aware of them, but you know, if you're at the top of a river in the watershed, maybe you really don't have very many threats or risks, and you may not really even require in-stream flow protection. If you're downriver, you may have a whole bunch of threats. If you're near a large urban center like the Chattahoochee River in Tennessee, or I mean in Georgia, they're just surrounded by threats. And so I would encourage you to take a look at those things and decide what your risks truly are and whether or not you should pursue in-stream flow protection. And those threats are typically things like climate change and drought. Like we're seeing a lot of that right now on the West Coast, and we're getting a lot of water rights calls on the West Coast that may endanger rivers now in California. Water development proposals that we see all over the West, like here in Colorado on the east slope for groundwater extraction or pipelines and dams. Energy development. A lot of us have heard about hydrofracking in Texas and the Marcellus Shale up in the northeast United States and then in North Dakota. There's also waters needed for solar and hydropower, and so we're seeing those kinds of proposals. And then there's the usual culprits like mining or agriculture, but they're really not too big of a threat right now in many of the parts of the country because they're just not moving as fast as these other types of extraction industries. And there may be others in your area that you're aware of that I don't even have on this list. So take a look at those threats and decide what your risks are for your river and whether or not you truly need in-stream flows. So this is another thing somebody might say, well, it's obvious, rivers need water. And I would say, of course they do, but you know, the river ecology science has evolved a lot over the last 30 years. And we've learned a lot more about why rivers need water, and so I'm going to quickly describe some of those processes for you and resources so that we're all on the same page. In order for a river to continue to function and maintain that channel shape and form, we have to move sediment through the system, and that requires flow. And there's an equilibrium or a balance between water and sediment that can be upset if you start pulling water out of the system, and that can shrink the size of your river or basically eliminate some features that are really important for other resource values. And so we talk a lot about sediment transport and channel or geologic processes or geomorphology, and the intent of that is to keep enough water in the system to continue to construct the physical components of that natural channel shape and form. Of course, those processes also are important to things like riparian vegetation, fish, wildlife, and recreation and aesthetics. And so one of the important things about flow for vegetation is flows need to be delivered during the right time for seed dispersal and germination. You can see a line of trees along this top picture where the waters were up on that bar, and basically those seedlings found fresh mineral surfaces and they were able to establish themselves, and now they will try and track the flow of the river and the groundwater down and hopefully survive without desiccating. And so flows, and when I talk about flows, I'm talking about frequency, magnitude, duration, rate of change, and timing. And so we're looking at this whole variability, and it's much more complex than in the old days when they just typically looked at minimum flows for fish. So in addition to riparian vegetation, of course, fish need water. This is a picture of a humpback chub in the middle picture on the Colorado River. You know, and we've learned a lot about those different components of the hydrograph that are needed for fish to migrate, to spawn, to maintain those food webs, to eliminate predators. And so we look at flows in that term. We also, all of us know that in-stream flows are needed in many instances for other wildlife like river otters or bald eagles or muskrats or other things, although I don't think they need the same kind of habitats or flows that fish typically do. Of course, we all love our rivers for recreation and the aesthetics and scenery. They provide some fantastic sounds and comfort. They also provide us a lot of joy in terms of fishing, wildlife photography, recreational floating, whether that be in kayaks, canoes, rafts, or even inner tubes. And so we can do a pretty good job now of taking a look at boatability needs. Aesthetics are a little bit more esoteric and hard to sometimes pinpoint. One of the areas that we've looked at in the past few years is a little bit new to a lot of people, and that's the importance of the flow to the historical or cultural feature. And sometimes that may be a grist mill or a bridge, but in other instances it's the need for flow to do the historical and cultural interpretation of, for instance, the Civil War battle or the food and fiber necessary for some of the original Indian people that lived on those lands in terms of providing for their families. So that's kind of a quick summary of why rivers need flows for resource protection. So the first tool I'm going to talk about, and if I use any terminology, chime in on the chat that you don't understand, is the Federal Reserve water rights. And this is a legal doctrine that basically was established back in 1908 in the Winters case, that basically acknowledged that when the federal government reserved or acquired land from the public domain, whether that be for a national park, a forest, a monument, a military reservation, or an Indian reservation, the Congress impliedly reserved sufficient water to achieve that purpose of that reservation. And the best example would be an Indian tribe. You know, if we put a tribe on a reservation, certainly they need enough water to continue to maintain their homeland and provide for their people and irrigate their crops. And so that was the concept, but it is not an explicit reservation of water in this case. It's an implied reservation, which basically means it has been interpreted through case law in the courts. It's traditionally applied in western United States. It's arguable as to whether or not a Federal Reserve right can exist in the eastern U.S., but that we won't even go there today. As I said, Federal Reserve rights were initially recognized in 1908 for the Fort Belknap Reservation up on the Milk River in Montana, the Winters versus United States, where the United States represented the tribe and basically undid the priority system up there and secured water on the Milk River for the tribe. Later on, the doctrine was applied to other federal reservations, including forests and national parks, in a case called Arizona v. California. It was further limited to primary purposes in the members' decision in New Mexico, which was a Forest Service case, where the Supreme Court decided that under this implied reservation of water, they meant for primary purposes. And for the Forest Service, that meant for watershed protection and timber production. Favorable conditions of flow is actually the term in the Forest Service Organic Act. And so they didn't mean to secure water for other things such as recreational fish and wildlife, which under the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. So that was somewhat limiting to the Forest Service, and that's caused them problems for a lot of years. Later on, it was extended in a Park Service case to the Devil's Hole pupfish in Nevada, which are a small population of unique desert pupfish that live in a geologic feature in the desert, and they use a spawning shelf that's really important, and caperts were pumping groundwater, and it was beginning to harm the spawning and the fish population. And so the Supreme Court ruled that the implied reservation of water also extended to groundwater, not just surface water, which is becoming more and more important these days. Another form of a Federal Reserve right to think about or consider is in Section 13C of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which explicitly recognizes a Federal Reserve water right for the amount of water necessary to accomplish the purposes, again, identified in the Wild and Scenic River designation. And so those purposes are focused more on outstanding remarkable values. And again, this is an explicit recognition. There's a few other instances in some of the case law and other places where Congress has explicitly recognized, for instance, groundwater at Great Sand Dunes National Park, or the need for groundwater or surface water down at the San Pedro Riparian Conservation Area. So occasionally Congress does say, I meant what I meant to say. I want to clarify, there's some misperceptions sometimes in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act about in-stream flows. It has nothing to do with the concept of free-flowing condition, which is kind of illogical. But basically, when Congress talks about free-flowing condition, they're talking about modification of the waterway. They're not talking about protection of in-stream flows or some form of a water right. You have to do that under that Section 13C that I just talked about. And again, its focus is on the quantification of the flows necessary to protect the outstandingly remarkable values, whether that be geology, fish, wildlife, ecology, recreation. As you can imagine, Federal Reserve water rights are very controversial. They are very complex. They cost a lot of money. They put the states versus the feds head to head. And one of the primary reasons is Federal Reserve rights create a whole bunch of uncertainty, and especially for folks or Indian tribes, which jump to the front of the line because they have typically a priority date of time immemorial. And so if we had a designation of a wild and scenic river, which we're going to talk about in a minute, of 1991, and it's year 2015, and I secure this water right, I jump in front of all those people between 1991 and 2015. So it upsets a lot of people, and it also creates a lot of uncertainty for those trying to develop water or infrastructure and spend money on that infrastructure in terms of uncertainty. The other unique part of a Federal Reserve water right is you can quantify for current and future use. So unlike somebody applying for a water right for agricultural use today to irrigate wheat and say it's 100 acre feet, they only get 100 acre feet. If they decide they need more, they have to go ahead and apply for that. In the case of a Federal Reserve water right, we can project that future use out 50 or 100 years and actually secure a water right for that reservation today, and so that upsets a lot of folks. In addition, a Federal Reserve water right can't be lost through non-use, unlike a state right. So we don't have to use that future use today, and we don't even have to put it our present use to use tomorrow and worry about losing it. And as you can imagine, with all these concerns, Federal Reserve water rights are really expensive to secure and adjudicate, and most of them have to be adjudicated through some form of a court process. Generally, two ways to define elements of a Federal Reserve water right. One is litigation, which I just mentioned. Usually in the West, it's through a comprehensive basin-wide adjudication. Costs lots of money, lots of time, can last for years and decades. Another way to approach a Federal Reserve water right is a negotiated settlement. And the Park Service has been quite successful the last decade or so at reaching a number of agreements in places like Idaho, Colorado, and also Utah. We've just signed our Arches Water Rights Settlement Agreement 3 weeks ago with the governor of Utah to protect surface and groundwater flows in Arches National Park. So some states are willing to negotiate those things, but not always. Here's a list of adjudicated Federal Reserve water rights for wild and scenic rivers, just for your information. I think there's 5 states up on this list, so a number of states have actually recognized Federal Reserve rights for wild and scenic rivers. Some of them may have taken, again, years to get there, though. So the second tool I want to talk about is state-based water rights or programs. Many states recognize in-stream flows or environmental flows as a beneficial use. Most states have their own unique program, and so you have to look at each state individually to decide if you could succeed in using that tool, and then what the rules of the game might be for those tools. One of the concerns I have about state-based programs is sometimes they're limited to specific resources under the statute, which was by choice generally. And for instance, in Nebraska, you can only file a water right for fish, wildlife, and recreation. That means if you're trying to secure flows for scenery or riparian vegetation, it's not recognized as a beneficial use in Nebraska, so you could not seek an in-stream flow for those purposes, which might not meet the mandates of the reservation or the Wild and Scenic River, or what the stakeholders are trying to achieve on their particular river. The other problem is, it's not necessarily a problem, but it can work both ways, is that sometimes the in-stream flow water right has to be held by some entity in the state. For instance, here in Colorado, they have to be held by the Colorado Water Conservation Board. They're put in front of the board, they're voted on, and they're approved. But an individual or a federal agency can't necessarily hold those rights. So you have to look at your state to decide whether or not who can hold the rights for the benefit of the river. Another sometimes problem that we see is that these in-stream flow water rights are reviewable, or that they have sunset provisions. In other words, you can get an in-stream flow today, but it can be reviewed in, say, 10 or 15 years, and it could go away. It could be enlarged. It could be much smaller. And so they don't really create the same level of certainty that you can get with a Federal Reserve water right. So you have to look at your state and see what all those various statutes and conditions are. So what I thought might be helpful is to kind of walk you through a real case example for the National Park Service. We've been trying to secure in-stream flows on the Niobrara National Scenic River for about 8 or 9 years. The river was designated in 1991. It's 76 miles, and it's in northern central Nebraska. 9 miles is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which at the Fort Niobrara National Wildlife Refuge, and 67 miles is managed by the National Park Service downstream of the refuge. And you can see in this picture there's some pretty phenomenal views, nice geology, riparian vegetation. A lot of the critters use this river, and it gets a heavy recreational use by canoers and tubers. It's located in north central Nebraska, like I said. The 76 miles is shown in yellow. We also have a 20-mile reach at the mouth of the Missouri River, but I'm not going to talk about that segment today. And you can see that whatever implications that could occur on the Niobrara National Scenic River reach out fairly far into this blue shaded watershed. And so if we're calling people out or affecting water management in this large watershed, we could actually affect a large number of water users in Nebraska. The purpose of the Scenic River designation was, under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, of course, was water quality and free-flowing condition, which are always included, and then outstandingly remarkable values, such as geology, recreation, fish, wildlife, scenery, and paleontology. There's of course, you can see in the left picture, there's 270 waterfalls and some fantastic scenery. There's also a number of endangered species like the piping plover, least tern, pallid sturgeon, and whooping crane that we're trying to protect. And then there's some phenomenal recreational activity that are kind of unique floating opportunities in Nebraska. The other thing is, because the river down cut through the geologic formations, there's also a substantial paleontological resource that's available and has been exposed by those natural channel processes that we're trying to protect. So in Nebraska, corn is king. Basically, ag rules in the state, and most of the focus in the state is about producing corn. It has created a number of problems for us, because during this period of time when corn prices were going up and ethanol production was being discussed, everybody wanted to put more land into production, install more center pivots, and do more groundwater pumping. And we were beginning to get concerned that that was going to cause a problem for the Scenic River. And so you can see in this picture the growth in groundwater pumping, this is only for June or August period, has gone from, say, 50,000 acre feet in around 1960 to well over 800,000 acre feet. And in this system, it is a groundwater fed system fed by the sand hills in Nebraska, and so groundwater pumping can have a substantial impact on surface flows in the Niobrara River. Part of that, we looked at the average daily discharge, and it's a little bit cluttered here because the period of record is so long, but we started to see some downward trends that concerned us, and so we wanted to start investigating what was going on and what resources we were trying to protect. You can also see that about 1964, pre-1964, there were a lot more peaks, and those were stopped by a number of reclamation projects up on the river, and so the river now is a little bit more constant. When I say that, it has fewer peaks, and that the low flows are a little more constant all the time. Under Nebraska Surface Water Administration, it's the doctrine of prior appropriation, which is first in time, first in right. So a water user with a 1900 date can use the river to extinction if they are senior to someone who has a 2000 water right. The permits required to divert water, the right shall never be denied except if there is a concern about public interest, which is very debatable as to what that means. And then the public may object to the application, but they've got to have standing, legal standing. In other words, you have to have a water right, a recognized water right on this river before the state will allow you to participate in that process to protect in-stream flows, for instance. Water Rights Administration in Nebraska is somewhat unique. They have the Department of Natural Resources is in charge of surface water, and the groundwater is managed by the Natural Resource Districts, NRDs, which are local governments. They're primarily an elected board, composed largely of agricultural folks, so they tend to lean towards agriculture and corn production. And so sometimes this creates a conflict internally in the state of Nebraska between these two groups, and when they're trying to conjunctively manage ground and surface water, it's not always a clear-cut approach. In addition, Nebraska is somewhat unique because irrigation is given a preferred use. And so during periods of shortage, an irrigator can enter into a subordination agreement with a hydropower user or municipality, for instance, and actually buy that right to use that water during periods of drought. So Nebraska does have an in-stream flow program. Again, since we're talking about state tools, only two entities in the state of Nebraska can hold the permit, and that's the Nebraska Game and Park Commission, which is their fish and game folks, and these natural resource districts. Beneficial uses, again, are limited to fish and wildlife or recreation. The state of Nebraska only has two in-stream flow rights that have been established for Long Pine and then for the Platte River, and both of those primarily for endangered species. They have never sought a in-stream flow water right for recreation, but the Niobrara may be the first time that they try that. Of course, they can't interfere with senior appropriations, and this is somewhat unique too. In Nebraska, they have to consider the economic benefit of leaving the water in-stream versus the out-of-stream use for other uses such as agricultural use. And so that creates a burden that you don't see in many other states. And it can be reviewed every 15 years. So here's the sunset provision about, potentially they could review it in 15 years, and this water right could essentially go away if somebody determined that the water was no longer needed for resource protection. Groundwater use in Nebraska is focused mostly on correlative rights. In other words, if you're a landowner, you're entitled to extract as much water as you want if the use is beneficial and use it on your property. All you need to do is get a permit to drill a well from the NRD, and again, note, not the state. And the amount is based more on the acreage and crop irrigation requirements than other things. And nobody can really review or object to your groundwater application. So you can see as this influx was coming of new desires to produce corn, there's a lot of people that it's pretty easy just to go out there and drill a well, put in a center pivot system and start producing corn and without even thinking about what it does to the in-stream flows in the Niobrara River. To make things more complicated for the Park Service in this case, not only do we have to deal with the Department of Natural Resources that manages surface water, we have 3 NRDs in this case along this reach of the river. So there's 4 different boards of authority, so to speak, that we have to work with in order to protect our scenic river. So with all this said, what we undertook was a whole bunch of work. Over the last 5 years, we've spent a lot of money to try and understand what the in-stream flow needs were for various resources, and working with the Nebraska Game and Parks. And we've done this list of studies, looking at economic and social values of recreational floating. In other words, how much does a canoe livery deliver to the economy of Valentine, and how important is that compared to agricultural development? We've looked at the boatability requirements for recreational floating, primarily kayaks, canoes, and tubers. We've also looked at environmental flows on the whole river reach from the mouth up to the headwaters in Wyoming on using a mesohab simulation model for fish and wildlife. And we've done that cooperatively with the Nebraska Game and Parks. We've done a number of hydrologic climatic studies to look at the effects of climate change. And we've undertaken some geomorphologic studies to look at the importance of flows to sediment transport and that channel shape and form. So where's that gotten us? To be honest, nowhere. We still don't have in-stream flow protection on the Niobrara, but I think it gives you a sense of the complicated things we've gone through and the amount of money we've spent to try and protect our river. But we've also participated in other processes about annual assessments for connected water supplies, telling them why we think the basin might be near fully appropriated or fully appropriated. We've filed objections to surface water applications for new uses, and to date all of them have been dismissed because we do not have a quantified Federal Reserve water rights in the state of Nebraska's mind. So we've been unable to at least stop new development for now. And then we've worked with the Nebraska Game and Park Commission to seek the in-stream flow, but to date they haven't gotten the approval of their commission to file that application. And we started discussing that in probably 2009, and here we are 6 years later and they still haven't even filed the application. So we really don't have protection. So that kind of gives you a feeling for how complicated a state process could be, and we could probably talk for hours beyond that, but that gives you a sense of some of the hoops you might have to jump through and the things you might have to think about if you're doing a state-based in-stream flow water right. So now what I want to talk about is the third tool in the toolbox that I call, just other flow protection tools. And so there's a lot of ways you can influence the thought process about in-stream flows in your river by working in other arenas, and some of those are listed here. For instance, if you work through the environmental processes that are out there, there may be an Endangered Species Act, a recovery plan, recovery program. There could be some reservoir reoperations, EISs that are being done to secure flows for endangered fish. There may be a number of NEPA projects, in terms of participating in a new development for a hydropower plant on forest lands or a new diversion dam or other things that you can insert your thoughts, and you can articulate what the science and your resource needs are, and hopefully get folks to at least pay attention to them or listen to what might be needed to protect the in-stream flows and the resources in your river. There's some other tools, like under the Clean Water Act, you can participate in Section 404 dredge and fill permitting. That's not as productive as some of these other things. Or a pretty powerful tool under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is Section 7 evaluations that have to be done by the 4 administrative agencies, that being the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the BLM, and the Forest Service. And any water resource project within the bed and the bank requires those agencies to look at the effects of those projects on water quality, free flow, and in-stream flows necessary for ORVs, outstanding remarkable values. And in fact, those agencies can veto those projects under their authorities if that were to need to happen. We've also found that there's great opportunities to work with the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation on reservoir operations. When they're tweaking their reservoir operations, you can put in requests to manage some of those flows, to improve the flows for fish and wildlife, for recreationists. So participate in those processes. The Corps has a master water manual process, and the Bureau typically issues new EISs for reservoir reoperations, and you can at least articulate why you care and why your river needs water. There are also opportunities to work with FERC relicensing or licensing under the hydropower, and you know, FERC can require specific in-stream flow studies to help define what those needs are, and then they can attach conditions to those licenses, and so you get to potentially secure some flows through that process. Some agencies have special use permitting authorities, whether that's Forest Service or Park Service, and sometimes you can attach conditions that may require bypass flows or diversion requirements. This has been very controversial in Colorado around ski areas and has led to some proposed legislation that limits federal agencies' abilities to use administrative authorities to do those things, but they do exist. And of course, you can work with your local stakeholders and friends of the river and see if you can't enter into cooperative agreements with state agencies or other stakeholders to try and see if you can't improve water operations like at a conservation district or a municipality so that you can keep the river
just from better. The percent you invested in it, right? So from that.
Can you put your speak on mute, please?
A change of use.
So in summary, what I wanted to hope to achieve today is just kind of expose you to a thought process. And that thought process really is about if your river is important, which most of our rivers are, and you need to keep water in it, have you even thought about how you're going to do that? And so I would encourage anybody that's trying to achieve that to make sure you walk through this process of evaluating your threats or your risks. Whether or not you really need to seek an in-stream flow water right, because that can be a very political process, or whether your river will be fine without one. Second of all, develop information and science necessary to articulate why you care. Why do you need water? In many instances, the Park Service has gone to the table and somebody will say to me, Bill, why do you need water and how much do you need? And without some knowledge and science, those are pretty difficult questions to answer. And on the flip side, it's not fair to those other stakeholders who are trying to develop water to just, for us just to say, well, I need it all. I mean, that's just not going to fly. And so you have to decide if you can invest the time and money to collect the science and the data to support what those needs are. And I kind of call it the so what question. People are going to say to you, well, if you take out a bucket of water, so what? What's going to happen to the resources? And you need to be able to describe those concerns. And then next, consider those tools in the toolbox. What in-stream flow protection tools are you going to try and use? Are you going to insert yourselves in day-to-day administrative processes, or are you going to take the next big leap and try and consider filing a state-based or in-stream flow water right? And those can be very challenging processes. They can take literally decades to secure the protection that you might want for your river. And lastly, because of the complexity and the politics, you've got to always make sure you're coordinating with management, and you got to have your lawyers involved because many of these processes are legal in nature, and so it can be quite a challenge sometimes to herd the cats and keep those legal and policy and technical strategies on the same path, but it's better to start that discussion early rather than later. If you really want to protect your river, you got to start thinking about jumping in the canoe like these two little old ladies on the Niobrara and dive in and decide what you want to do next to protect the resources that you're trying to protect.
Well, thanks, Bill. somebody says it would be helpful to quickly review threats and what flow protection should focus on.
Okay, so my intent of talking about threats is, for instance, if you're at the top of the watershed, for instance, one of the streams here in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, the water flows off the mountains no matter what, and the park doesn't let anybody really go into the park. So there really aren't very many threats, and you may not need to want to dive into in-stream flow protection approaches because it's just not useful. It's not going to change things, and it's just going to take you into a bunch of political battles. But if you're down here on, say, at Zion National Park on the Virgin River, and there's a whole bunch of development proposals, we call it like a conduit park, then you have a lot of different threats, and you have to look at those threats and risks and decide whether or not they're climate change or water development or energy development or whatever they are, and what you need to do to secure in-stream flows, who you need to work with, and what kind of science and data you might need to collect. And so, Rissa, they said also on the resource on this slide, requiring flows, or?
Mitch asked it would be helpful to quickly review threats and what flow protection should focus on. Okay,
so what I was trying to describe here is a little bit about the river ecology science and how it's evolved the last 30 years. And so in the old days, 30 years ago when in-stream flows were secured, typically we, scientists or agencies, would look at the minimum amount required to basically provide for a fish. And so that, in my mind, sometimes the theory was that that's just enough to keep their fins wet. And that's not adequate based upon the new river ecology science we understand today. And so we know that we need in-stream flow to move sediment, whether that's suspended sediment or bed load, why it's necessary to, why it's important to create the channel form and shape and those mosaic of features, whether that be a meander pattern or a braided system or a mid-channel bar or whatever that's out there on the river for other resource values. We know that riparian vegetation requires water at the right time of year to disperse and germinate seeds on newly created mineral surfaces. For instance, willows and cottonwoods typically drop their seeds in May and June, and so we need those rising limbs of the hydrograph then to move the seeds downriver and put them up on these bars as you see in this top picture so that they can germinate and not be flooded away. Of course, fish need water, but we've learned a lot more about why fish require water for things like spawning bars, what kinds of conditions we need to maintain the gravels on those spawning bars, migration patterns, food webs, you know, how do the in-stream flows protect the macroinvertebrates that many of these fish feed on, how do they create competitive disadvantages for non-native fish such as a brown trout that maybe can't do as well as a native shiner or something. And then, of course, water is really important to recreation and aesthetics, whether that's for floating or photography or fishing, or the sounds and the noises created by the river and the aesthetics and the beauty of the combination or mosaic of the riparian vegetation and the water and the sky. And then I also talk quickly about the importance sometimes of in-stream flows to historical and cultural interpretation, and whether that was the reason the grist mill was built along the river, or maybe why the native people, the Indian people, lived along the river, put their encampments there, harvested food and fiber that were important to their livelihoods, or maybe the river was important to the whole battle in terms of some strategy for the battle and getting across on a horse or something like that.
Here's a question. How do you address timing and magnitude of these flows? Is an in-stream flow right or protection seasonal or variable over multi-years? And how is this worded? Very carefully, and I guess it kind of depends, are my answers.
We have water rights, for instance, on the Black Canyon and the Gunnison that are linked to a forecasted runoff. And then we actually have a delivery schedule where we are trying to achieve a magnitude of a flood of 10 to 12,000 CFS at least once every 7 to 10 years. And then we have defined what shoulder flows would be. In other words, how wide is the hydrograph? We've defined ramping rates. I think we decreased the ramping rate 500 CFS a day. And then we have base flow. And so what we try and achieve is variability for all these different components of the hydrograph. And that can be accomplished in a number of ways through different language and agreements or decrees. On the flip side, we have some other agreements, and I kind of call it reverse quantification, like at Zion National Park, where we have offered up 5,000 CFS on the East Fork of the Virgin River to the state of Utah for future development. And then we get the rest, which means we get all the natural variability without having to play God and try and predict what that will be. Then we have constraints on where that development can occur in the basin, how many storage reservoirs, how large they can be, how the reservoirs are distributed, what the diversion limits are, and what the bypass flows are, so that we, through our science, have been pretty certain that we can reduce the impacts of that development on the East Fork of the Virgin River. So those are a couple ideas about how we can do that. Other questions?
Yeah, a couple more questions. For Nebraska, he said that they've only actually protected fish and wildlife. To what extent can riparian habitat be protected because it is directly related to fish and wildlife? Or, if recreation is a qualified value, to what extent could the scenic and fish and wildlife values be protected as part of the recreation experience?
I think that's untested in Nebraska. I mean, I would argue that if riparian vegetation, for instance, cover, overhanging cover on a bank is an important part of the fish habitat, that I would at least make an attempt to do that. But I think that's untested. I don't think we quite know where we will go in Nebraska on recreational flows. I think we can convince people, you know, that water is necessary to maintain some of those. We certainly can convince people that we don't want to drag boats down rivers, but it becomes more challenging when you talk about a recreational experience. In other words, we want to provide a spectrum of flows so that the little old lady from Germany can come wade in the river and maybe dabble in her tube on up to some bigger flows, so that people who like to kayak or canoe in whitewater actually can do that. But it's untested in Nebraska and a lot of other places. Bo Shelby and Doug Whitaker have done a good job of describing those needs in a number of other rivers in the western U.S.
Oh, one more question. What is an example, this is from Rick Clark, what is an example within NPS system where the agency did stay the course and secured a water right in cooperation with a state?
Well, we've done that in a number of places. We've negotiated deals in Idaho for Yellowstone National Park. We've negotiated in-stream flows on the Mancos River at Mesa Verde in Colorado. We've got 8 agreements at 8 different parks in Utah that were we stayed the course and negotiated those agreements. And so we've also negotiated agreements in Montana under the Montana Reserve Water Rights Compact for all the parks in Montana. We've got a negotiated agreement in Coronado National Memorial and Saguaro National Park down in the San Pedro adjudication in Arizona. So we've got a lot of examples, and if Rick wants them, Rick, just send me an email and I can send you paper copies or scanned copies of some of those agreements if you want them.
Joan says, I missed the audio at the beginning. Did you talk about eastern water rights and the opportunity to implement federal reserved rights in the east?
I didn't in detail. I mentioned those. Theoretically, they can exist. But basically, the only Federal Reserve water right, for instance, that I'm aware exists in the east is with the Seminole tribe in Florida. And that was a negotiated agreement between the tribe and the state. In theory, reserve rights can exist certainly on wild and scenic rivers. There are those that would argue that Federal Reserve rights can't exist in the east because there is no land, reserve lands from the public domain. I would argue, and this is untested, that if there is a reservation out there that Congress intended to protect and they needed water, either whether that's an Indian tribe or a military base or a national park, that Congress didn't intend for those reservations to exist without that water. So I think the likelihood of them being successful is good, but the problem will be a procedural one. Many of the eastern states don't even know how to deal with reserve rights. They don't have an adjudication process like the West. And so if I send a reserve right to the state of North Carolina, they might say, oh, great, what do I do with this? I don't have any procedures or processes to deal with it, and we might have to go to federal court, or the agency might have to go to federal court to define that, and that could take a decade just to get through the political and the procedural ramifications, but a federal agency still might succeed on down the road. It's all complicated.
One more. Are there any states that have a good system for integrating groundwater and surface water?
Yeah, many states assume hydrologic connectivity. Utah does, Colorado does, and so unlike the example I used in Nebraska, they kind of assume it's connected, but then they've created a system where they're not managed conjunctively until they get to be over appropriated, which is the wrong time to do it in my opinion, and then they have to write an integrated management plan to force conjunctive management. But, you know, a number of western states, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, they manage their surface and water right conjunctively through their doctrine of prior appropriation or their adjudication processes. And what we're finding in a lot of the areas, groundwater is becoming a bigger issue, but in order to manage them, it really requires a groundwater model to evaluate those effects and then to manage them into the future, and groundwater models can cost millions of dollars and take 3 to 5 years to build for larger basins, or so it's a challenge to get everybody to commit to those kinds of resources to make the right decisions. Any others, Rissa?
Pretty quiet. I think the questions have ceased.
Okay, I put them to sleep with all the legal mumbo-jumbo.
Thank you for attending, everyone who's out there, and Bill, thank you so very much for taking the time for your performance today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.